How you doing?
Definitely Mexican. That's one of my questions. What's that today?
Okay, all ashore that's going ashore. I said I would let you know about asking questions during our question and answer period. If you possibly can, although they didn't hand out the papers that I was hoping they would, if you possibly can, could you write them down? Could you write the questions down briefly? We started this custom after our third San Jacinto Symposium in Houston, when one of our questioners gave a speech that lasted several minutes. So a succinct question, and if you don't have a piece of paper, come up right after. I will stay here during the entire 15-minute break before the question and answer session. And if you can't write it down, you can give it to me and I will jot it down in a handwriting that only I can understand. And read, and I will try to. We will try to distribute the questions. If you don't ask for a particular respondent, we'll try to distribute the questions to those best able to respond. But if you want to ask a question of a particular speaker, that's perfectly all right. Now, it is my distinct pleasure, and something I've been waiting to do for a long time, to introduce Miguel Angel Gonzalez Quiroga. His recent prize-winning book, War and Peace on the Rio Grande Frontier, is a remarkable piece of work. It does what I once tried to do when I was writing about Texas and the Texas Revolution, and not just talk about conflict all the time. You know, the Anglos came in and they hated the Mexicans, and the Mexicans hated Anglos, so they let them come into the country. It just didn't make any sense to me. I was here in Houston at Rice University, where my very first paper in the honors program was on Mexican immigration policy, because it made no sense to me that if this kind of antagonism was always there, that A, the Mexicans would invite them in, and B, they would come. It is a far more complex situation, and there was a great deal of cooperation and cordiality between the two ethnic groups that mixed and mingled and intermarried in this Rio Grande frontier on both sides, north and south. However, the book that I'm more fond of that Miguel did is Confrontando el Álamo, La última lucha de Davy Crockett y otros mitos de la Revolución de Texas. I like that book very much because I wrote it. That is the Fondo Editorial de Nueva León's edition of Miguel's translation of my book, Sleuthing the Alamo. And working with Miguel was an absolute joy as we exchanged emails and texts back and forth over that summer of 2009, I think it must have been. But I had known Miguel for some years before he did that, and he asked me once on a bus going somewhere in Texas, "What about translating your book?" I said, absolutely, and boy, am I glad I had him do that. He was the perfect host, both in Monterey and in his hometown of Zuazua. And he can explain to you someday why there's a town named after General Zuazua, Z-U-A-Z-U-A. It's a great name. Miguel is going to talk to us today about the causes of the revolution as seen from Mexico. And he brings a great deal of knowledge and wisdom to this subject, having lived and loved in both Mexico and the United States, and has become a citizen of both countries. once the United States made that legal. So without further ado, Miguel Ángel González Quiroga.
I'd like to thank the Texas Historical Association for inviting me to this San Jacinto Symposium. I want to thank Jim Crisp for that very generous introduction. I discovered I could still blush. And I want to thank all of you for being here. Yesterday, I had the privilege of joining Jeff Dunn on a tour of the San Jacinto battleground. And he explained very expertly all of the details of the battle and how it took place. Before leaving, I read the inscription on the face of the San Jacinto monument, and part of what I read stated that the unjust acts and despotic decrees of Mexico's unscrupulous rulers led to the revolution in Texas. As the Queen of England once famously said, "We do not agree." Now, I've been asked to give a Mexican perspective on the Texas Revolution, and I aim to do this by talking about the event before, during, and after it happened. To understand the events before 1836, I'll discuss two issues: the conditions in Mexico at the time and the way in which the Mexican government perceived American expansion in general and the Anglo presence in Texas in particular. It's no secret that from its inception, the United States wanted to devour the entire continent. The Founding Fathers said it clearly. A cursory look at the papers of John Adams and Thomas Jefferson reveal that intention. In 1788, Jefferson learned that Spain was granting permission for immigrants to settle in the Louisiana Territory if they became Catholics and obeyed their king. And this led him to remark, "I wish 100,000 of our inhabitants would accept the invitation. It may be the means of delivering to us peaceably what may otherwise cost us a war." Now, if this was uttered by one of the most exalted figures in American history, I can imagine what some of the baser elements of American society were thinking. Even before Mexico was a nation, ambitious Anglo-Americans coveted the northern lands of New Spain. In 1805, Aaron Burr and his associates sought to carve out an empire from that territory. Of course, Mexicans were well aware of that history. And they were also well aware of the various filibustering expeditions into Texas, beginning with Philip Nolan and ending with James Long. In the early 1820s, Jose Maria Sosaya, the Mexican minister in Washington, wrote that the United States had ambitious designs on the province of Texas. In 1823, a Mexican diplomat in Philadelphia, Jose Torrens, wrote that he personally heard General Andrew Jackson declare that the way to obtain a territory was to occupy it. That's an early version of the concept that possession is 8/10 of the law, 9/10. The occupation of a territory was successfully practiced in Florida, which was taken from Spain. Jose Maria Tornel, another Mexican statesman, viewed with alarm the relentless westward surge of Anglo-Americans, the acquisition of Louisiana, the seizing of Florida, and the same process of massive occupation of a foreign territory being repeated in Texas. In his brilliant new book, Unsettled Land, mi amigo Sam Haynes has used a very elegant phrase to describe this process. He calls it the shape-shifting impermanence of the nation's boundaries. The process of occupation and seizure was explained by Manuel Mieri Terán in his report on conditions in Texas after 1829, or in 1829. After settlers occupied a neighboring territory, they began to assert various rights. This was followed by complaints, threats, and diplomatic pressure. Then they incite uprisings in the territory in question and usually manifest a deep concern for the rights of the inhabitants. This was the playbook that had been used in Florida and would be repeated in Texas. It was Mieri Terán's report, which followed the Fredonia Revolt by Hayden Edwards, that finally moved decision makers in Mexico City to do something about Texas. They passed the law of April 6, 1830. This law was reviled in Texas and denounced as another act of oppression, but it was an honest attempt by Mexico to stop the invasion of undocumented immigrants coming across its borders. I don't know if you can see the caption from the back. One Mexicano is talking to another Mexicano saying, "All these American immigrants should be sent back home. They're a threat to our Mexican way of life." And he's referring to two frontiersmen who were riding up, one in a horse, one in a mule, one of them wearing a coonskip cap, who I think we can imagine who that might be, and the other is carrying a jug, and it doesn't look like water. Throughout the 1820s and early 30s, one of the most consistent and persistent voices in Mexico about U.S. expansion was Carlos Maria Bustamante. He condemned the intrigues of Joel Poinsett, the first U.S. minister to Mexico, who was sent to divide and weaken the country and make it easier for the United States to acquire its territory. Bustamante wrote that the threat of American invasion was very real. In 1829, the newspaper El Sol reported that an American invasion was imminent. This caused an uproar that was heightened by the publication of a letter from respected General Nicolás Bravo, who was in New York at the time, because he included a compilation of articles from various U.S. newspapers promoting American expansion into Mexican territory. So by 1830, and even before 1830, it was clear that the United States had designs on Texas. And as we shall see, this was a threat that ultimately had a large impact on Mexican politics. Tensions between the colonists and the Mexican government increased in the 1830s, and the calls for a U.S. government takeover of Texas transitioned into concrete actions. public meetings were held in many parts of the country calling for donations and volunteers to wage war on Mexico and liberate Texas from her grip. News of these movements became known in Mexico. Adventurers and fortune seekers began streaming into Texas. According to José Valadez, these volunteers were the main protagonists in the war in Texas. It was especially infuriating to the Mexican government that settlers were given special concessions and privileges only to have them break the law. Violations included the rejection of Catholicism, the continuation of slavery, and the sale of lands acquired by concession. Further, Texans demanded exemptions from tariffs at the Texas ports. Mier y Terán indignantly asked Stephen Austin, in what ports from Hudson Bay all the way to Cape Horn are tariffs not charged? For a century and a half, writes Josefina Vasquez, Texans have cited multiple Mexican offenses, but an analysis of the facts shows that they constantly received lands, exceptions, and privileges. The Texans sent Stephen Austin to Mexico City, who sought to cancel the prohibition of Anglo entry into Texas, and he succeeded. The Mexican Congress annulled the prohibition. Austin also sought an extension of the exemption to pay tariffs. This, too, was approved. When Austin sought separate statehood for Texas, it was explained to him that at that moment it was not convenient. But the national government would exhort the Coahuila y Texas legislature to make reforms to benefit the province. And this was done the following year. The state legislature of Coahuila divided the province into 3 districts to increase Texas representation. It approved the use of English in administrative and judicial processes, and it allowed for trial by jury. In this same tenor, the Anglo-American Jefferson Chambers was named Superior Judge of the Texas Circuit. The satisfaction of these demands was acknowledged by Randolph Campbell, one of Texas's great historians. So most of the Texas demands were met, except the one that they held most dear, to keep their slaves. It became clear that the Texans' talk of states' rights and freedoms was the freedom to oppress people of color. Let us now turn to conditions in Mexico. To say the country was in bad shape is to make a massive understatement. Even before independence, the financial demands of the Spanish crown left New Spain impoverished. 10 years of civil war decimated half of its labor force. Moreover, while it also destroyed its productive and administrative capacity. And moreover, Spain was hell-bent on recapturing its colony, so Mexico had to contract onerous debts to defend itself. The country was indebted to England and threatened by Spain in the 1820s and by France in the 1830s, and it had to fend off attacks by those 2 nations. Shortly after independence, Mexico adopted the model of a federalist republic, but a people who lived for 300 years under an authoritarian imperial government was ill-prepared to practice republican institutions. During the Federal Republic, the states were given greater power than the national government, an arrangement that led to the loss of national cohesion. What's more, according to Josefina Vasquez, Mexico's experiment with radical federalism deprived the national government of fiscal power over its citizens, which made it dependent on the states and condemned it to failure. Federalism exacerbated another problem, regionalism. Caciques and caudillos, regional strongmen, ruled the various provinces and thwarted national unity. At times, regional caudillos used their state militias to defy the national government. The defiance of regions such as Yucatan, Zacatecas, and Coahuila threatened to tear the nation asunder. In the 1820s and 30s, Mexico was a nation of little over 6 million inhabitants, 2/3 of whom lived in impoverished rural communities, virtually all of them without schools. There was not a surplus population or a constant influx of immigrants to send to the north to settle in Texas and help defend the northern territories from Indian invasions and foreign encroachments. Mexico was fragmented culturally and socially and deeply divided politically. Various political factions reflected disputes between Republicans and monarchists, Federalists and Centralists, and liberals and conservatives. Factions were potentially deadly to a republic. Hamilton knew this, and he wrote about it in the Federalist. But this admonition was ignored in Mexico. The Catholic Church and the military were important centers of power. The church owned 1/4 of the nation's wealth and didn't hesitate to use it to impose its will. The military served as a stepping stone for self-seeking, ambitious men to satisfy their ambitions and claw their way to power. Corruption was endemic. Carlos Maria Bustamante made a revealing statement when he wrote a eulogy upon the death of Mexican President Miguel Barragán. He stated that in an age of corruption, good men were a curiosity. Another source of weakness was political instability. Revolts were common in the first quarter century of its existence. Only one president served his full term. In the period 1824 to 1855, there were 45 presidential administrations, each lasting an average of 8 months. There were 100 pronouncements, rebellions, or uprisings, one every 4 months. Now, I'm aware of the revisionist interpretations of the period that argue that political instability is greatly overstated, that the different factions were composed of hombres de bien, a political elite or Creole oligarchy that, despite their differences, shared certain goals, such as avoiding anarchy, promoting progress, and defending the national sovereignty. I get all that, but the revolts existed. They can't be erased or wished away. They're an objective fact. You've probably read that this period was known as La Anarquía. It's for a reason. Many Mexicans became convinced that federalism was the cause of the anarchy. So it is little wonder that by the mid-1830s they were ready to ditch that system and try a different model. Texas historians have often cited the change to centralism as the precipitating cause of Texas independence from Mexico. Josefina Vasquez, Mexico's premier historian on Texas matters, disagrees. Contrary to what the Texans said, centralism was not conjured up by Santa Anna or the church or the military or the oligarchy. There was a groundswell for centralism in most of the country because of the chaos produced by the excesses of federalism. Furthermore, Vasquez explains that the shameless publicity in the U.S. press about annexing Texas made Mexicans aware that it was necessary to change the system because the radical federalism of the Constitution of 1824 placed in jeopardy the integrity of the nation's territory. Vasquez argues that Mexico's turn to centralism occurred in October 1835, when the movement for Texas independence was well underway. She believes the Texans got it backward. It was not centralism that caused Texas separation. It was the threat of Texas separation that caused the turn to centralism. Now, I noticed some raised eyebrows. How dare she say something like that? Those of you familiar with the subject might argue that the turn to centralism in Mexico began much earlier. In 1829 and 1830, they say that under the presidency of Anastasio Bustamante and the leadership of Lucas Alamán, Mexico was a centralist government. But these, although to be sure they were centralists, these men had to govern within a constitution that honored the Federalist Republic. So I made a timeline. The movement toward a centralist republic began in earnest in early 1834 when Santa Anna overthrew his own government and ousted Valentin Gómez Farías from office. Then in March 1835, the national government placed limits on state militias, another move toward centralism. And this was resisted by Zacatecas. Its defiance was crushed by Santa Anna, and the Texans feared they would be next. The timeline gives an idea of the sequence of events, but it must be recalled that well before 1834 or 35, Mexican political leaders knew that anarchy was roiling the country and making it weak and making it susceptible to a takeover by the United States. Many were convinced that the anarchy was caused by federalism. So it's plausible to argue, well, they decided, because of that, they decided that a turn to centralism would help pacify and unite the country, and this, in turn, would help it to resist the expansionist designs of the United States. So it's plausible to argue that the threat of Texas secession was a strong motivating force for adopting centralism. One final word on Texas' view of Mexican centralism. When the Texans first asked permission to colonize Texas, that province was ruled by the Spanish monarchy. I'm wondering, was that not a centralist government? When Texans say that they revolted because Mexico turned to centralism, Mexican historians can rightly say that this is brazen hypocrisy. The Texans openly defied the Mexican government in 1832 when they attacked Anáhuac and Velasco in June and Nacogdoches in August, driving the Mexican military out of East Texas. But in the second half of 1835, events accelerated. In July, the war party in East Texas called for settlers to take up arms and form volunteer units. The Mexican military commander in Texas, Martín Perfecto Cos, made things worse by refusing conciliatory gestures by the colonists and by ordering the arrest of William Travis. The first violent incident occurred on October 2nd at the Battle of Gonzales between colonists and Mexican troops. Meanwhile, armed volunteers continued streaming into Texas, among them 2 companies formed in Louisiana, the New Orleans Grays. In the face of these provocations, the Mexican government had to respond. A rebellious province had attacked the national government and must be subdued. Imagine Abraham Lincoln allowing the attack on Fort Sumter to go unchallenged. To defend the integrity of the nation was a matter of national honor. Santa Anna was chosen to march north to quell the revolt. The most critical concern was the state of the Army, which had been largely decimated by the internal conflicts of 1832 and 1833 and had to be largely improvised for the unexpected campaign. Of the 30,000 troops promised, only 6,000 became available. Most of the weapons were antiques from the colonial period. The Army was without doctors or medical attention or adequate medicines. Morale among soldiers and officers was low because Santa Anna had cut wages and rations. Most of the troops were raw recruits, forced into the Army against their will and without any kind of preparation. They would be firing a weapon for the first time in Texas. The description of this army and the enterprise before it is captured by José Valadez. The army, which marched to Texas in December, was a column of selfless men who were there by force or by desire for adventure or because it was their calling. They were marching to a far-off land to risk their lives not only to the enemy's bullets, but to the harshness of the desert. Without the technique of war, without military discipline, Mexico, because of its profound and bitter poverty, could not send to Texas an army other than that band of ragged creatures who, with their women and children, filled the roads heading north. The Army tried to extract provisions from the states through which it passed, but there was little there. Enrique de la Peña wrote that the rear guard of the Army found itself short of provisions because more than half the force ahead of them, under General Ramirez y Sesma, was composed of women, mule drivers, boys, and exploiters, a family similar to the locusts that destroy everything in their path. Fast forward to May 1836. A small part of the Mexican army had been defeated at San Jacinto, and Santa Anna was being held prisoner, while most of the army was heading south, leaving Texas for good. The Mexican general had signed the treaties of Velasco, recognizing the independence of Texas, which the Mexican government would never accept. What followed was a series of excuses, explanations, and recriminations for Mexico's disastrous loss. The first reaction was disbelief, since the Army had won all its engagements prior to the Battle of San Jacinto. The Mexican government explained that the loss was decided by the arbiter of nations, meaning that God willed it. A variation of this theme was that the loss was the result of the fortunes of war. The Mexican president, Jose Justo Corro, described it as a momentary setback and exhorted the people to continue the fight. Other justifications followed. The Texans cowered before the Mexican army and avoided doing battle when they saw that a small part of the army was separated from the rest. They struck a mortal blow. This was facilitated by an accident of nature, since a sudden rise in one of the rivers prevented the rest of the army from coming to the rescue. In another account put out by the government, the Texans lost battle after battle and kept retreating. So the Mexican army got overconfident. One newspaper reported that the retreat of the devious Texans was a calculated strategy to lure the Mexican army farther into the interior, much as the Russians had lured Napoleon's army into the interior before destroying it. It seems clear that Mexican military and political leaders, as well as the press, underestimated the Texans, who were generally referred to as drunkards and cowards. Some believed that marching through Texas would be a parade. After the Alamo, but before the Battle of San Jacinto, José María Tornel, the Secretary of War, proposed the creation of a Legion of Honor to recognize the heroic deeds of the soldiers involved in the Texas campaign. There were certain rules. A general had to win a battle against a force of equal or greater strength in which a quarter of the enemy was either captured or killed. And the first anniversary of the Legion would be celebrated the following 6th of March, because that is the date when the glorious Texas campaign began with the storming of the Alamo. When José María Luis Mora, Mexico's greatest liberal thinker of that period, heard about Tornel's Legion of Honor, he declared that Tornel and honor had nothing in common. Many of the recriminations that followed the defeat at San Jacinto centered on Santa Anna. Enrique de la Peña, one of his harshest critics, wrote that the military leader was obsessed with obtaining glory. That led him to elevate a simple uprising in Texas to the level of a war, according to José Valadez. Santa Anna loved power and craved adulation. He wanted to be at the center of everything and refused to delegate authority or listen to reason. He set out on a 2,000-kilometer march without planning or foresight. He attacked Béjar, a town without military significance and against the advice of his generals. He divided his army and steered it toward disaster. De la Peña saw the burned bodies at Goliad and condemned the cruelty of executing the prisoners and the stupidity of arousing the fury of the Texans and the people of the United States. These very judgments reveal the danger of following blindly a narcissistic leader impervious to reason and obsessed with his own importance. Of course, any similarity to the present is mere coincidence. Another series of bitter recriminations focused on Vicente Filisola and his ignominious retreat after San Jacinto. The office of the president delivered a stinging rebuke, stating that the retreat was shameful and accused Filisola of forgetting his duties and his sense of honor by obeying the orders of a superior who was imprisoned and acting under coercion. The harshest criticism came from General José Urrea, one of the few military men who was praised for his actions in the Texas campaign. Urrea blamed Filisola for all the misfortunes suffered by Mexico and said that Filisola was driven by fear. His was not a retreat, but a treasonous flight out of Texas. Filisola defended himself, declaring that he was trying to save the life of Santa Anna and 600 other Mexican prisoners. Besides, the Mexican army had exhausted its resources, and had he not marched back to the Rio Grande, his soldiers would have perished from lack of supplies, and Mexico would have been left without an army. The justifications and recriminations over the loss of Texas mainly circulated through the rest of 1836 and 1837. But Texas independence was the main political issue for the next decade, until the war between the United States and Mexico. All succeeding governments sought to continue the war in Texas and recover the lost province, but Mexican politicians realized that these goals could not be met. The Mexican treasury was chronically bankrupt. It could not sustain a strong army, and even if it could, the Texans had the backing of the United States. Mexico suffered a foreign invasion from France in 1838 and multiple Federalist revolts after 1836, including one in the Rio Grande region. The country remained politically divided, and the recognition of Texas independence was out of the question. Any political group that called for that measure would be ostracized and driven from power. Historically, Josefina Vasquez has summarized the Mexican position on the loss of Texas. Mexico could do little to keep the ambitious, aggressive, and energetic and unscrupulous Norteamericanos from our border. Mexico's territory was vast, sparsely populated, and the government lacked the means to defend it, distracted as it was by internal discord and European threats. Moreover, the Texans justified their separation, blaming Mexico for its military tyranny, its religious intolerance, and centralism. But the real reasons were the opening of the customs house and the issue of slavery. The loss of Texas had both immediate and long-range repercussions. In the following period, it triggered a series of events that led to the U.S.-Mexican War and the dismemberment of half of Mexico's territory. These losses and the humiliation that they caused forced thoughtful Mexicans to take a hard look at themselves, and this self-examination led to the sweeping movement of La Reforma and the Constitution of 1857. These profoundly changed Mexican history. In the longer term, Texas was the first of many humiliations that Mexico suffered at the hands of the United States, and it's one of the building blocks in the construction of Mexican nationalism. Mexico's identity was formed in large part by its relations with the United States, and all this began with the war in Texas. I do not wish to overstate this. The fact is, most people in Mexico do not really know what occurred 185 years ago, or how Mexico lost Texas or the other territories seized by the United States. In my own experience, I found that many of my students at the Universidad de Nuevo León, before I taught them differently, confused the Texas War with the war between the United States and Mexico. In the public school system, they had mainly learned of Mexican national heroes of the War for Independence in 1810, or the Reforma, or the Mexican Revolution of 1910. There were no heroes in the Texas War or the U.S.-Mexican War. So these are not emphasized in our teaching of history. Most Mexicans know little and care less about those events. However, a small but vocal sector of the population does care. This group is generally well-read, usually politicized, and keeps alive the historical memory of the loss of Texas. These Mexicanos know about Joel Poinsett, the American minister who did all he could to wrest Texas from Mexico. Jose Vasconcelos, who wrote about the cosmic race, associated Poinsett's name with not with a flower, but with American interventionism and aggression toward Mexico. Jose Fuentes Mares wrote a book that referred to him as an intriguer. Poinsett is to Texas what another American, Henry Lane Wilson, is to the Mexican Revolution, both repudiated as villains in our history. 60 years after the Texas War, one newspaper editorialized about the regrettable memory of Poinsett, who wanders like a dark and fateful shadow through the first pages of our history. The historical memory of the loss of Texas is kept alive in popular literature as well as in history books. In 2006, David Toscano of Monterrey published the novel El Ejército Iluminado. It's about a group of 5 deluded, handicapped kids who set out on a march toward the Rio Bravo, and their mission is to recover Texas and restore Mexican national dignity. They're led by Ignacio Matus, a history professor who's a hyper-nationalist who hates the United States. Examples of history books, such as El Álamo by Paco Ignacio Taibo, México Mutilado by Francisco Martín Moreno, and El Seductor de la Patria by Enrique Serna, also remind Mexicanos of the Texas and U.S.-Mexican wars. These books fan the flames of nationalism among a sector of the population. Unfortunately, they don't study deeply or the complexity, as Andrew Torgett points out, of these events. They continue to put a large part of the blame on Santa Anna for Mexico's misfortunes and for losing its northern lands to the United States. Now, Santa Anna and others should be held accountable. But Josefina Vázquez reminds us that without a doubt, we lost that enormous territory because we were unable to occupy it. Paradoxically, we've achieved this when it is no longer ours. Now, some of you remember the Harvard thinker Samuel Huntington and his work on the Clash of Civilizations. Well, he also wrote about the Hispanic tsunami in the United States. So I can imagine that Huntington is probably turning in his grave. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Miguel.
Thank you, Jim.
Thanks, Miguel. Seldom has our timing been better in the San Jacinto Symposium than with our invitation to Sam Haynes to come and speak about his version of the causes of the Texas Revolution. Everyone's talking about your book, Sam. Unsettled Land. Let me get the subtitle correct. The Struggle for Texas, from Revolution to Republic. And unsettled land has a number of meanings, some of them contradictory. If you work on the meanings of unsettled, there's some truth to both. Unsettled in that it was empty enough to attract people, and unsettled in that it was a mess. The recent interview that Sam did with the Austin American Statesman book reviewer points out just what a chaotic and changeable mess Texas was in the years of the 1820s and 1830s. For years, I tried to convince my students just how fascinating Texas was. Maybe Sam can do that. Sam, please.
Which one was yours? San Jack 2022. Third one down. Third one down. That's it. Okay. Great. Oh, is this self-explanatory? Probably. That's okay. I'll figure it out. How's everybody doing? It's been a long day. I'll try to keep this a little bit brief so we have plenty of time for questions. Do we have teachers in the audience? We do. Good. I like talking to teachers. I was a high school teacher myself while I was getting my PhD. And the first year, I taught seventh graders. That was the only job available. I wasn't all that keen, but they said, if you want a job here, you're going to have to teach seventh graders. So I did it. Another job opened up, thankfully, I'll say, in the upper school the following year. So I taught Texas history for a year, and I absolutely had a blast. I had studied European history in college. I actually grew up overseas. And so I knew very little about American history, and I knew nothing about Texas history at all. And teaching Texas history at the seventh grade level was just so much fun. And I always think about that one year because that's really what sort of started on my professional career to study Texas and particularly study the Texas Republic, which was really my area of expertise. So, but it's so easy teaching seventh graders the story of the Revolution and the Republic. I mean, it has a certain clarity to it, a moral clarity, but it's also a very sort of easy story to tell. And I think the takeaway from this, from today, that you should have, is that this is a really, really complicated event. We started off hearing about the perspective of Anglo colonists. We heard about Tejanos and what their opinions were. We've tried to look at it from the point of view of Mexico. I'm going to look at it from the point of view of the United States. We've even had sort of an international, global view of this event. And so, so Miguel did mention, I do use this term when I'm trying to describe the Texas Revolution. I do talk about its shape-shifting impermanence, and I like the term shape-shifting because it looks so different from so many different angles. And so the story that we tell seventh graders, it's a very easy one to tell, I think, with sort of good guys and bad guys. And the takeaway from today's symposium, I think, should be that it's complicated. It really, the more we peel back the layers of that onion, the harder it gets to understand. And I would say something else. I mean, you think it's complicated already. Look, there are thousands and thousands of Native Americans who we haven't talked about today. We have the Indios Barbaros in the west and on the Edwards Plateau. We have thousands, maybe 10,000 Native Americans, refugees from the United States. Choctaws, Chickasaws, Cherokees, and so on, Shawnees, Delawares. All of those people are part of this revolutionary experience. Now, we are not talking about Native Americans today, but I do remember about 5 years ago, this symposium did a terrific event on Native Americans and brought in some of the best historians of Native America. So all I'm saying is the Texas Revolution you think you know, I think there's always room to learn more. Now let's see if this works. Solely, purely, simply American, the Americanization of the Texas Revolution is the name of my talk. I apologize. The book's coming out in 2 days. I know this is a shameless plug. If you're a historian, I mean, I worked on this thing for about 5 years. I know Jim worked on his Ehrenberg book for much, much longer than that. These take time. That's all I'm saying. And so it's out. I'm very happy with it, at least until I asked my son to take a look. I don't know what I was thinking. You know, fishing for compliments, that's always a mistake with my son, who's an IT guy in Austin. And so I said, so what do you think? And he thought about it. He said, well, I think it needs more emojis. So anyway, I've never been able to get that image out of my head every time I look at the book. Okay. So I want to start. I'm doing the American side, okay? Before I do, the whole premise of Unsettled Land, really, is to try to understand the complexity of this event, involving an event that involves Anglo-Texans, Anglo-Americans, Tejanos, Mexicans, Native Americans. It is a mess. It is a shape-shifting struggle, and we just need to see it in those terms. And the more we see it that way, I think its moral clarity really does begin to dissolve. So I want to start with the Banks Arcade. This is October 13th, 1835. So it's 11 days after the Battle of Gonzales, or the skirmish at Gonzales, let's call it that. And on Magazine Street, there was this enormous emporium. They also said it was a coffee shop, but it was a place where people went to shop. And they had that evening, they had a raucous pro-Texas meeting. The news of the Battle of Gonzales had just arrived, and so the organizers were trying to drum up support for the revolution, or for the rebellion. It wasn't clear really what it was at that point. And 120 people, men, white men, signed up on the spot. And they, of course, are the New Orleans Greys, who promptly set off, I mean, really within a few days. And they would be, or at least some of them, would be there in late November, and they would take part in the siege of San Antonio, siege of Behar. There's also someone else who was there. And I know I've been asked to talk about the Americans, and I intend to do that, but I want to sort of draw attention to this individual for comparative purposes. Jose Antonio Mejia, the most important leader of the Texas Revolution you've never heard of. He does make it into the history books sometimes, but not enough. His career from the early 20s, his early 20s, had been tied to Texas. He first comes after the War of Independence, and he's a translator for the Cherokees, and he goes down to Mexico City. And he's there to negotiate for the Cherokees, although, quite frankly, I'm not so sure about that, because he has some land speculative activities of his own, which tend to conflict with the Cherokees. I'm not really sure that he ever leveled with them, because he was trying to get an impresario contract of his own on land the Indians actually occupied. But that's neither here nor there. He had gone on to have a very successful career in Mexico. He moved in the right social circles. He was an officer. He had married well. And he was an aide-de-camp of Santa Anna at the Battle of Tampico. Later, he has a diplomatic assignment to Washington. So he's very, very prominent. But he's particularly interested in what's going on in Texas. And this goes back to his very, very early days as a translator for the Cherokees. He's one of the very first Mexicans to understand the value of not only Texas lands, but Anglo immigration from the United States and what that would do to the value of those lands. And so he is buying up Texas acreage at a rapid clip. He owns almost a 250,000 acres of land along the Navasota River before he's 30 years old. He gets Lorenzo de Zavala interested in empresarial activities as well. And together, those two men are responsible for, or at least in Mexico City, for bringing about the repeal of the April 6, 1830 law. Nobody does more than Mejia and Zavala, at least on the Mexican side, to bring in Anglo-American settlers. At the same time, Mejia is a Federalist, and when Santa Anna breaks with his Federalist friends, with the Plan of Cuernavaca, and it appears as if he's going to abolish the Constitution of 24, which he does. He locks Congress, he locks the doors of the Chamber of Deputies and the Senate, and that power grab is so shocking to people like Mejia and Zavala. Zavala comes back he was a minister to Paris, and he comes back to the United States and then later to Texas by the summer of 35. Jose Antonio Mejia immediately, he is a general at this point in time, immediately breaks with Santa Anna and flees to New Orleans, as Valentin Gomez Farias does. So at the Banks Arcade on October 13th, Jose Antonio Mejia is in the audience. And in the many speeches, if you're familiar with these kinds of events in the Jacksonian period, there are all kinds of speeches to get the crowd riled up. All the invited speakers are American. None are Mexican. Even though Mejia had been in town for several weeks, Farias, actually several months by that time, I'm sorry. Farias also several months, and they had been organizing pro-Texas meetings of their own. Mejia attends. I'm not sure about Farias. There's no evidence that he did, but he was in town at the time. And Mejia goes, and he could not have failed to notice, in addition to the fact that all of the speakers were American, that nobody says anything about restoring the Constitution of 1824. It was all about Anglo-Americans being oppressed by a centralist authoritarian leader, and so on and so forth. So nothing about restoring the Constitution of 1824. Anglo-Americans needed to be rescued from, as they put it in those days, foreign thraldom. Okay, it's not a word that we use every day. It's not a word that it's not a word I think I've used ever until now. But that's what they called it, foreign thraldom. So how did Mejia take this meeting? He certainly paid attention. He talked about it later. And the evidence suggests that he still thought that Anglo-American immigration, Anglo-American involvement in Texas was a good thing. People were beginning to, who had once held that view, were beginning to peel away. Valentin Gomez Farias was now convinced that Anglo-American immigration had been a big mistake. Tornell, who has been mentioned several times today, he had felt that way for a very long time. But Mejia, bless his heart, thought that Americans were fighting for self-rule, that they were fighting for autonomy, that they were not fighting for secession. And so the fact that the Constitution of 1824 never came up in this meeting that lasted several hours didn't seem to faze him. He was already actively involved in trying to establish a support for Federalists, and he had helped to organize a group of men who were Federalists in exile who planned to unseat the centralist regime. Mejia was no longer on speaking terms with Santa Anna. Zavala was no longer on speaking terms with Santa Anna, excuse me. And they had met briefly in New Orleans in the summer. And the idea was that Zavala was going to go to Texas, help to organize a revolt there. He was going to lead a revolt to Tampico, and Gomez Farias would stay in New Orleans and help to run the resistance there. Okay? Why Tampico? Because these men were operating according to a very well-worn playbook. In the earlier rebellions in Mexico, you always went for the customs houses because it was the customs house that paid for the army. So the plan was, and by the way, Mejia had already done this before. Take Tampico, then take Matamoros. You've got all of the revenue coming into the country. The Mexican army can't be paid. There will not be an offensive, an attempt to resubjugate Texas if Tampico and Matamoros can be captured. That's his plan. And he's organizing men in New Orleans when he attends for that mission, which you could call a filibustering expedition, I suppose. And he's organizing this mission when the Banks Arcade meeting takes place. But he's got his program. He knows what he wants to do. And he's perfectly happy to see the Americans organize and create this new regiment, the New Orleans Grays, which is outfitted in some very smart-looking gray uniforms, and within a few days marches out of New Orleans down to the dock and makes its way to Texas. So basically, in the fall of 1835, just after the news of the skirmish at Gonzales, you've got sort of two efforts going on to unseat the centralist regime in Mexico City. One spearheaded by Anglo-Americans, and another spearheaded by Mexicans, by enemies of the Mexican president. I'm going to come back to Mejia later, at the end. I want to talk now about, and this is the focus of my talk, the American role in the Texas Revolution. And I'm just going to give you I'm going to look at this for a few months, and I figured that's all I would have time for. So I'm not going to take it all the way to the end. But we refer to this phenomenon, American support for the war, or I do anyway, the Texas fever. That's what newspaper editors called it. The Texas fever has treated us worse than the cholera. Journeymen, apprentices, men and boys, devils and angels are all gone to Texas. By the time it was all over, this continues long after the Battle of San Jacinto, well into the summer of 1836, young men, almost exclusively from the Lower South, are organizing regiments, joining regiments, volunteering regiments that have already been formed, and making their way to Texas in the thousands. And these are huge community events, okay? The regiments are formed, and they are given a rousing send-off with speeches and a parade. The women of each community sews flags for these new volunteers, sashes, uniforms, and what have you. And so the Texas fever is this cultural phenomenon that grips the South, the Lower South. You find evidence of it in the North, but not to the same degree. Grips the Lower South for well over 6 months. Okay? And this had never actually happened before. This had not happened in the War of 1812. This had not happened in the American Revolution. This was the first time this occurs. If you know anything about the War of 1812, some of those militia units were not very happy about crossing state lines. There was an attempt to invade Canada, and they weren't happy about that either. And yet here in 1835, 1836, thousands and thousands of young white men, with the support of their communities, gladly march off to a foreign country to fight for and to, as they see it, to rescue Americans. And so what I want to do is try to shed just a little light on why they go, because this hadn't happened before. We see it in the Mexican War, we see it in the Civil War, but this is the first time. The raising of thousands and thousands of volunteer soldiers has taken place in the United States. And it really is almost as I'll explain later, almost a patriotic act for these local communities. Okay, it's really pretty straightforward. I mean, I think one reason is land. Now, I'll talk about, oops, what happened there? We're getting ahead of ourselves. I must have pressed that twice. One reason is land, and I want to say a little bit about economic motivations here first. When we study Texas history, one of my sort of pet peeves is that we don't spend enough time trying to understand Anglo-Americans in the United States. Because let's face it, these people come to Texas as adults, as fully formed adults. And so we really need to understand what's going on in Jacksonian America. And Jacksonian America is a fascinating period. That's what I say to my students. They just look at me like I've lost my mind. All they can think of is, well, there's really nothing going on here. Let's get to the good stuff. Let's get to the slavery crisis and the Civil War. What's fascinating about the Jacksonian period is how much is going on beneath the surface. So, you probably know that states begin to repeal their property, their laws which bar people from voting if they don't own enough property. Every state is different. By the 1830s, every state has abolished those property qualifications with the exception of South Carolina. And so if we are talking about citizens, white male citizens, then by the 1820s and the 1830s, the United States has become a democracy. A democracy for the few, but a democracy nonetheless. And that has an enormous impact on the United States as a whole. I don't want to simplify this. I think there are several factors, and there's sort of a synergy of factors involved. But for the sake of this sort of short intro today, let me just say that once you start giving white men the right to vote, once you empower them politically, then they start asking for all kinds of other things too. All right, that's clearly, I cannot touch anything, can I? Is that right? Now, am I supposed to point it at the, nobody knows.
You can use the buttons, the arrows. On the keyboard.
On the keyboard? Sorry about this. What have I done? Okay, hold on. There we go. I got it. Okay. I will not go anywhere near that. Where was I? So once you empower people politically, then they sort of insist on other rights as well. And one of the amazing features of the Jacksonian period, historians like to call this the market revolution. Maybe that's why it turns everybody off, I suppose, at least my students. Their eyes glaze over when I talk about the market revolution. But I try to make the point that economic democracy is just as important as political democracy. And what happens in the 20s and the 30s is this really a cultural revolution where white men believe that they have the right to get rich. Now that may sound obvious, but in fact it wasn't, because in colonial America, that's not what people thought. In colonial America, you have a culture of deference. You're supposed to know your place. By the 1820s and 1830s, white men did not know their place. And this was constantly on the minds of social critics, who like to call this the anxious pursuit of gain. It was also, European travelers were fascinated by American men during this period. Alexis de Tocqueville, one of the most famous travelers, French traveler, who writes Democracy in America, says, you know, I've never seen a country. I mean, I've seen self-interest before. I know what that is, but I've never seen a country of self-interested people. And so what he means is that the anxious pursuit of gain had been nothing short of a mania which gripped the United States in the 1820s and the 1830s. So is it any wonder that when the revolution breaks out and there is immediately the prospect of acquiring land west of the Sabine, that thousands of men don't take advantage of that opportunity? Sam Houston, long before he has any right to do so, within days of the skirmish at Gonzales, he's in Nacogdoches at the time, and he immediately writes letters to newspapers in Louisiana saying that any man who shows up with a good rifle and 100 rounds of ammunition will get land. Actually, as it turns out, the consultation makes good on that promise, but he was basically making it without asking anybody's permission. But so once the promise is made, thousands of young men are coming, and they're coming for land, many of them. Others, I think men of prominence also, came hoping they could get rich in Texas, that a small investment would yield greater rewards. There was, I think, during this period, and it's part and parcel of this same idea of this manic ambition that gripped men during this period, this idea that political careers could be made on the battlefield. Because, of course, as we know, that's what had happened to Andrew Jackson. That's what had happened to William Henry Harrison, to Richard Johnson, and countless others. And that's what happens here. Okay? Mirabeau Lamar, the secretary of the governor of Georgia for a while, then a failed newspaper man. He is a private in the Texas Rebel Army in March. He is a colonel in the cavalry by April, and he is Secretary of War by May. Okay? And so nobody's career is more meteoric than Mirabeau Lamar. And everybody wanted to replicate that success. And some did. I'm really interested in this guy because my book is about the Revolution and the Republic. And so Thomas Jefferson Greene comes during the Revolution and he stays right up to the end of the Republic, and then he hightails it for California when they find gold there. Thomas Jefferson Greene is a speculator. He had speculated in Florida. He had speculated in the Red River area, claiming to own a lot of land there. I don't think there's any evidence that he really did. But he is a whirlwind of entrepreneurial activity, jumping from one place to the next, looking for the main chance, looking for the next big score. And the news of the revolution occurs. He's in Florida when he hears the news, off he goes. And he has political ambitions too. And the first thing he does is put himself at the disposal of the provisional government. They are on the Brazos at that point. And he says, if you give me a brigadier general's commission, I will go back to the United States and I will raise troops at my own expense. And they do. They give him a brigadier. He is now Brigadier General Greene. He had a few weeks of, he was educated at West Point for a few weeks in his teens. And now he is Brigadier General Thomas Jefferson Greene. So the revolution had already succeeded as far as Greene was concerned. He was now a prominent figure in this new country, literally overnight. Now, his dreams of military glory don't actually pan out. He shows up in June of 1836, like John Quitman, bad timing. Okay? Revolution is over, but he still wants to draw attention to himself. He is a shameless self-promoter, and the very first thing he does when he lands at Velasco Beach is Santa Anna has signed the Treaty of Velasco. He is literally leaving the next day. The ship is ready and moored in the bay, ready for him to disembark. Thomas Jefferson Greene arrives with his men and refuses to let that ship set sail. He argues that only the Texas Congress, which hasn't met, can allow Santa Anna to leave. So within literally days of his arrival, or let's call it his re-arrival in Texas, he has already drawn attention to himself. And Thomas Jefferson Greene spends the next 10 years trying to become a man of note, a man of renown. He becomes more infamous than famous, I have to say. If you've ever heard of the Muir expedition, he is second command of the Muir expedition, goes into Mexico. And his men, he actually does not draw one of the beans. He was spared that experience, but he was second in command of the Muir expedition in 1842. Lifelong Houston enemy, moves to California afterwards and is a lightning rod for controversy there too. I do not have time to talk about his career in California, but he did more of the same there. And so Thomas Jefferson Greene is this great example of these men who were just possessed or obsessed with this manic ambition, and that is so common to the Jacksonian period. Okay, I'm going to talk about somebody else in a minute. Okay. So many Americans go for economic reasons. And there's another reason as well. Okay? It's not just money. It's not just this attempt to draw attention to yourself and become someone of note. It's not just self-interest. Or if it was self-interest, it was certainly very often masked with a much larger rationale and a much nobler rationale. And to explain what I mean by that, I want to talk about nationalism in Jacksonian America. Now, don't forget, I know, you're all here to learn about the Texas Revolution, and I'm just telling you what Jeff Dunn told me to talk about. He wants me to talk about the American experience, and I think and it's exactly right. I mean, to understand the Revolution, we need to understand the Americans who come into Texas, and so we need to understand their economic motivations, and we need to understand the larger, sort of nobler rationales with which they try to explain their conduct. And here again, I'm going to use somebody, okay? John Sowers Brooks, who some of you I know some of you know. He is a 21-year-old bartender in Virginia, I think. He's from Virginia anyway. But he's a 21-year-old bartender. Things have not gone well for John Sowers Brooks. He had a brief stint in the Marines, in the U.S. Marines. He had to get his family to pull strings to get him in. And then he hated it, and he had to have family strings pulled to get him out. And that was something of a minor family scandal. And it's very clear from his letters that he is really sort of consumed with this sense of shame. And he wants to, tells his family in his letters home, they are so poignant and so heartrending, to forgive all his follies and mistakes. And so he sees his journey to Texas as a redemptive one. He wants to be a success, of course, but he doesn't talk about that so much. What he really talks about is how he is engaged in a noble cause. And so this view, John Sowers Brooks' view of the revolution as a noble cause, is not unique to John Sowers Brooks. Everybody talks about this, whether they believe it or not. Some do, perhaps some don't. Brooks does. Brooks does because he talks about it all the time. He doesn't ask his family's permission. He just jumps on a ship and he goes straight to Texas, and he enlists in the Army, and he joins the Georgia Battalion under James Walker Fannin. Okay? That's a little foreshadowing if you know what happens to James Walker Fannin. Okay? All right. So Brooks arrives, and he is, like many Americans during this period, sees the revolt as something that is very, very similar to the American Revolution. I've actually talked about this on occasion. I did talk about it in the a Jacinto Symposium many, many years ago. And I was thinking about this. Should I talk about this? And I thought, okay, nobody remembers. Most of the people will be new, and even if they were there, they've forgotten what I was talking about. So the Jacksonian Americans, in addition to being consumed with their own self-interest, also believed that there was this, they believed in the idea that the American Revolution, which, don't forget, had happened 50, 60 years earlier, the American Revolution was the thing that they had to live up to, that their forefathers had given them this legacy, and they had to be true to that legacy. They had to show that they were that they could do what their forefathers had done. Now, this may seem like a stretch because we're now talking, it's 1835, 1836. It's been 60 years, really, since the American Revolution. But in the 1820s, you have 1826, you have the Jubilee year. There have been books written on the American Jubilee, more than one. And it's not just, you and I think about July 4th as a day, and then it's over. This went on an entire year. Lafayette arrived from France. He was now in his, I don't know how old, in his dotage, let's say that. And he gives this tour of the United States. They say he is seen by perhaps 1 million people. There is a monument building mania after 1826. Maybe you've seen the Bunker Hill Monument. That's commissioned in 1826, but it's not actually finished until later in the decade or earlier in the 1830s. Revolutionary War novels become popular during this period. You've probably heard of James Fenimore Cooper. We remember him today, if we remember him at all, for the Leatherstocking Tales. But in fact, in the 20s and 30s, he was more famous for his Revolutionary War novels. So was William Gilmore Simms. Again, somebody we don't read anymore, and for good reason. Their historical biographies were popular in the 1820s and the 1830s. Patrick Henry, who was little known during the Revolution, becomes a household name by the 1820s. William Wirt's biography is published in 1817, I think, something like that, and it goes through 18 separate editions. Everybody had read this, and everybody knew that Patrick Henry had given a speech in the Virginia House of Burgesses in which he ended with the rousing cry, give me liberty or give me death. Actually, he probably did not say that. William Wirt was recreating that speech from the memories of people who claimed to have been there. So some historians are doubtful. It's a good story, okay? It's a good story, and everybody knew what it meant. And liberty or death, you see this. This is how people end their letters. This is what you see on these flags that men carry into battle from the United States. This is the Troutman flag. It was made by a young woman, Joanna Troutman, in Georgia. This is a flag for the Newport Kentucky Regiment, which also, if you'll read closely, says liberty or death on the sword there. Americans were obsessed with the American Revolution, and were still obsessed with it in the 1830s because the Texas Rebellion, seemed to evoke so many similarities. And you go back and you look at the newspaper accounts of this event, and newspaper editors are constantly saying, we are now in the role of France. We have to come to the rescue of this young nation, to rescue it from foreign thraldom, and young American men need to follow in the footsteps of the Marquis de Lafayette, who was 19 when he became George Washington's aide-de-camp. And there is no question, I cannot do two things at once. There is no question that John Sowers Brooks takes this to heart, okay? And so he's trying to explain to his family why he's gone, because he knows they're not going to know he's gone until he's already there. And so he spends a lot of time, these early letters, trying to justify his behavior. I trust I have a holier motive than mere ambition. In other words, setting himself directly apart from people like Thomas Jefferson Green. The glorious struggle of our own ancestors in '76 must produce a sympathy for Texas in every part of the Union. We are all animated by one spirit, defiance to tyrants. And the letters have, there's so many great phrases in these letters. He says that at one point, their struggle will end at the gates of Santa Anna's iron-ruled dominions. They're absolutely a hoot to read. For a while. Because, as I said earlier, he attaches himself to the Georgia Battalion. Off he goes to Goliad. And it is, and you begin to see in those letters, he's there in February and there in March, you begin to see no, I do not want to call it a sense of regret, but a sense of, he becomes more fatalistic. He is no longer, the arrogance of youth is no longer evident, and he's depressed. And he begins to talk of death, and he writes primarily to his sister, but also to other family members, that maybe I will not be coming back. But if I don't, I will die a hero. He's already trying to justify his own death. And he talks about how he is fighting to save a country. The problem, of course, there's something else in those letters that he does mention. It's like, I'm here, but I haven't seen any colonists. And Fannin, in one of his letters to the General Council, says, well, we're at Goliad, we're at Fort Defiance, which is what it was called. We have 450 men under arms and 5 colonists. And so what that means, of course, is that everybody there had arrived within, really in January or later. And I think it's important to understand that. I was talking at the beginning about the complexity of this event. And we, in really kind of subtle ways, do things that undermine that complexity. And one is, and again, this is a pet peeve. Hey, I've got a lot of pet peeves, I think. But one of them is the use of the term Texian. I know people love that term because it gives Texas a sense of special identity. I get it. My problem is when it's used to refer to Anglo-colonists and to Anglo-American volunteers who have only just arrived. So everybody is a Texian. But in fact, a settler who came in the 20s is very different from someone who just got off the boat. It's an important distinction. It was a distinction to the settlers. It was particularly a distinction for Tejanos. In South Texas, as far as they were concerned, Texas was under American occupation. There were no Anglo-Texans, or darned few, with Fannin or with Johnson or Grant. And so Anglo-Americans may have been seen as friends and allies in some parts of Texas, but they were seen as enemies in South Texas, which is why many Tejanos flocked to the Carlos Ranch and put themselves under the authority of Carlos de la Garza, who leads a small, let's call it an army. It may have been 200 men under arms, who fights with General Urrea. Okay. So economic motives, this idea that being true to the cause of their forefathers, this is a noble cause, this is something that you need to do, and the Texas Revolution provides an opportunity to do that. These are the impulses that send Anglo-Americans by the thousands into Texas in 1835 and 1836. And I'm back to Jose Antonio Mejia. Jose Antonio Mejia was at the Banks Arcade, all right? Jose Antonio Mejia did not have a problem with the effort to raise troops and send them on their way to Texas, Jose Antonio Mejia thought that everybody at the Banks Arcade was fighting for Mexican federalism, for Texas self-rule. He had always believed that. He had come to Texas in 1832 with Stephen F. Austin after the revolts of 32, and the settlers there, and Austin as well, were able to convince him that there was no effort at independence, that they were not trying to steal Texas for the United States. He was satisfied in 32. He was still satisfied in 35. And off he goes to Tampico on a ship where he has recruited about 160 adventurers from New Orleans. Most of them are Americans, actually. Goes to Tampico. It doesn't go well. This is the first, I called him earlier in my talk, I called him the most important Texas revolutionary leader you've never heard of. I do mean that. The first major engagement, the first major battle of the Texas Revolution, let's forget Gonzales, it's really just sort of a brief skirmish. The first battle of the Texas Revolution is not in San Antonio in December, it's in Tampico in November, when they land in an attempt to try to take the customs house. The word of their coming is leaked. It all goes badly. The ship runs aground. The gunpowder gets wet. It's just sort of a comedy of errors. Many of these, they're filibusters, okay? Many of the men on the expedition are captured, and they're summarily shot by the Mexican army. Mejia's a little bit, is luckier, though. He charters another ship, and he goes to Texas, because in Texas, he'll be able to link up again with his Mexican Anglo conspirators and continue the revolt. He has every intention of continuing that revolt when he arrives, penniless and exhausted, a few bedraggled men in early December. And what he finds is that things have changed. I'm sure I have another image after. Oh, I do. Okay, fine. That threw me off. He is very pleased to learn that the governor of Coahuila, Texas, Agustin Viesca, who had been thrown in jail by a centralist general, Martin Cos, who's been mentioned before, but now had escaped and had moved to Texas. And Viesca, Viesca assumed that he would now be in charge of this rebellion, that the leading Mexican federalist in Coahuila, Texas, would now take charge of a rebellion which had been initiated by Anglo-Americans. And he was rudely disabused of that notion. Got to Goliad, nobody would talk to him, made overtures to Governor Smith. He wouldn't talk to him. Henry Smith regarded all Mexicans as inimical and treacherous. And so when Mejia shows up on the Brazos River after his Tampico debacle, he immediately writes to Viesca. And Viesca says, I'm not in charge. I don't know who is. And so he writes to Governor Smith. Mejia does. He gets no response. He writes him again. He gets no response. He writes him almost, not daily perhaps, but he writes several letters, about half a dozen. He never hears back from the General Counsel or from Governor Smith. The Texas Rebellion by that time had already become very, very clearly an effort by Anglo-Americans alone. That's what Governor Smith felt. That's what Anglo-Texans believed, I think, not all, but some. And certainly that's what all Anglo-Americans who were part of this Texas fever believed. So Mejia rather disconsolate, and I think that's probably an understatement, because let's not forget, he had done more to bring Anglo-Americans into Texas than any other Mexican official, with the possible exception of Lorenzo de Zavala. Brings these people in, and now to his horror, sees that he has been unwittingly involved in the dismemberment of the country. So he writes to his last letter to Governor Smith, says, it is clear, I'm paraphrasing here, but not by much, it is clear that my efforts are neither wanted nor desired, or my service is neither wanted nor desired. So he goes back down to the mouth of the Brazos, takes the first ship to New Orleans. Okay, I'm going to end with what I think, an even more poignant anecdote about the rift between Mexican Federalists and the Anglo-Americans who come in. Agustin Viesca now realizes, as Mejia had realized, that this is an American rebellion, that Mexicans are no longer wanted. And he goes to Nacogdoches. I'm never quite sure why he goes to Nacogdoches, or why he didn't just simply go back down to the coast. It was an easier way of getting wherever he wanted to go. But he does go to Nacogdoches on his way to Louisiana. And the citizens of Nacogdoches, the Anglo citizens of Nacogdoches, decide that they are going to hold a dinner, a banquet for him. And again, you have to know something about Jacksonian America, but these banquets were very, very elaborate affairs. And they were very proud. I mean, Nacogdoches is a small little town. They were very proud when Agustin Viesca, the elected governor of Coahuila, Texas, or the former governor anyway, was now visiting their town, and they wanted to make him the guest of honor at this banquet. Viesca accepted, the invitations went out, the food was prepared. It was a very big extravaganza, as these events always were. And it went off without a hitch, but for one thing. As they were getting ready for this banquet, it became known in Nacogdoches that somebody else had arrived. And it was David Crockett, the congressman from Tennessee. And Crockett was the most famous man in America, at least the most famous private citizen in America. Why he is famous is another matter. He's kind of famous for being famous, if you want to know the truth. But in any event, he was famous. He had written these, or had helped write, some books about his career on the Tennessee frontier and about his political activities. They had been enormous bestsellers. They were followed by a play called The Lion of the West, which was sort of loose, I don't want to say loosely about him, but people made the association that The Lion of the West, the play, was based on Crockett. In fact, it wasn't. In any event, he is the most famous person ever to show up in Nacogdoches. They already have a banquet planned for Viesca, and of course they want Crockett to attend. Viesca speaks no English, and of course everybody insisted that Crockett give a speech, which he was happy to do because he was there in Texas to speculate in land, but also hoping he could rebuild his political career. So he gave this rollicking speech about his bear hunting days back in Tennessee. He probably called them bars, I guess. And everybody loved it. By the way, wherever he goes in Texas for the next few weeks, he gives the same speech. Okay? It's a political stump speech. Everybody eats it up. Viesca can't understand a word, and he smiles somewhat wanly and uncomfortably. But in Nacogdoches, everybody thinks this is a great success. And Crockett, of course, goes on to fame in greater fame at the Alamo, and Viesca heads into obscurity in Louisiana. I love that story, and I love it because it sort of encapsulates for me how these two rebellions had diverged. And so when the most famous man in America arrives in Nacogdoches, it becomes clear that the rebellion that Americans are not just simply there to assist in a Federalist rebellion for self-rule. They have co-opted this rebellion entirely. They have made it their own. So, to go back to the title of my talk, The Americanization of Texas by early January was now well underway. Okay? Well, thank you all very much for being such a great audience. And we'll do Q&A, I guess, after this.